This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
All right. Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and I am really grateful to have a place to talk about faith and politics and philosophy and big ideas in our culture with all kinds of really interesting, accomplished people of goodwill in good faith. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Now, remember, I've said this before, I just can't say it enough. If you could take the time to leave a review on whichever podcast app you're on, it really does help. Certain apps only allow for ratings. That's awesome. 5 stars if you would. But others give the option of writing a review, and that does help in terms of our rankings so that other people can discover the program. And then I always love it if you would tell a friend, tell a family member, tell your neighbor, tell your friend from church, whoever. Just tell somebody about an episode you heard and how wrong you think I am or how crazy this all sounds. Just tell them. And then maybe you'll end up getting into a conversation about politics and religion. Hopefully you won't kill each other in the spirit of this program. The easiest way to find us is our main site, which is www.politicsandreligion.us, or feel free to connect with me on all the socials, even threads. I'm at Corey S. Nathan, at COREYS as in Sam, NATHAN, at Corey S. Nathan. All of that helps get the word out so more people can participate in the conversations just like the one we're having today with Yascha Mounk. Yascha Mounk is Associate Professor of the Practice of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University, founder of Persuasion, an online magazine devoted to defending the values of free societies. He's a contributing editor at The Atlantic, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the host of a really good podcast. I've been binging it lately, The Good Fight. And he is also the author, most recently, of The Identity Trap, a story of ideas and power in our time, which we'll be discussing at great length today. Yascha, thank you so much for joining me today. How you doing?
I'm great. I look forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. Now, I have to start with a really profound, deep, nuanced question, and that is a hot dog a sandwich? And why is that an important question?
I refuse to answer this question because I know that I would endear myself to half of your audience, but half of your audience might go on to hate me. It is a profound question for surprising reasons. There's this great researcher who was really haunted by the Holocaust and was trying to understand, why is it that when people are members of these groups, they can do these terrible things to each other? What is it about groups that makes us often willing to treat the in-group with great courage and altruism, but also can inspire terrible cruelty or violence towards the out-group? And he said, okay, let me start in the following way. I'm going to create groups that are so dumb and so pointless and so arbitrary that people don't have that kind of in-group favoritism. And then I'll slowly sort of ladle on more attributes to those groups until I get to the thing that makes people behave in that way, and that'll help us understand the world. And he failed completely, because even the silliest groups that he created, for example, by asking people whether they prefer the paintings of Klee or Kandinsky, made people favor the in-group over the out-group. And so I use this with my students sometimes. I have them debate, it's an intro politics class or something like that, and I have them debate whether a hot dog is a sandwich for a little while, and they sort of think I'm being weird, like, fine, we'll debate this. And they get into it. I'm going to have them play the simple distribution game. And it turns out that the people who believe that a hot dog is a sandwich would rather take home less money themselves, as long as the people who believe that it isn't a sandwich take home even less money, because they come to care about the group winning out so much, even about a silly question like that.
Yeah. You describe it as a certain type of groupishness, I think is the word that you've used. And do you think that's evolutionary, or is it something that is unique to our time and our culture, or is it this has been a problem since time immemorial?
I think the basic instinct of groupishness is built into humans. Whether that has evolutionary reasons or different kinds of reasons, you can debate. But we can see it in so many different contexts that it's really, really easy to trigger that in-group mechanism, to make people feel like they're part of a group. And then once they do, it has these immense consequences for how they treat people. Now, the one part of this that is less depressing, the one part of it is potentially inspiring, is the thing that determines which group you're a part of is really, really variable. Right. So one way we might think about it in the United States today, because of the census categories and other things, is by race, right? But the fundamental division of American society is whites and Latinos and Asian Americans and African Americans, or perhaps just whites versus people of color, right? In other kind of contexts, you might think of it religiously, right? The real distinction is between Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Muslims, or perhaps all kinds of different denominations within Protestantism, right? The real division in society is between nations, is between this country and that country and that country. For a whole centuries of European history, but I still haven't understood the fundamental division between Guelphs and Ghibellines, and I still haven't really understood what a Guelph is and what a Ghibelline is, right? So actually, we can think about how do we create identities that make it easier for us to collaborate, to work together, and that in a way has to do with my new book about the identity trap, because I think we've embraced a set of ideas recently that'll draw boundaries between people in ways often based on race, that'll make it harder rather than easier for them to overcome prejudices and collaborate. Even when a lot of the things we're doing to encourage people to draw lines in that way are well-intentioned, are, hoping to make the world a better place, I think it ends up creating such a premium on these forms of ethnic identity and creating so much zero-sum competition between different groups that it's not going to end well for our society unless we manage to get out of that trap.
Yeah, you toward the beginning of the book, and then you deal with it more extensively in the appendix. This ties into something about your background. You said at first gradually and then suddenly the center of gravity on the left swung from class and economics to culture and identity. And I wanted to tie that into a question I had about your background. You said that all four of your grandparents were arrested for being communists in Europe in the 20s and 30s. But by the 80s and 90s, when you were growing up, you said that their politics had evolved. So I was curious if you could share a little bit more about your own family's background. And then also, if you would, if you see parallels in the political movements your grandparents eschewed and what's happening on the left today. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting. So my grandparents, are Jewish, were born in shtetls in what today would be Ukraine, what at the time would have mostly been the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They experienced discrimination very strongly in their youth, and they were poor. And so they were very drawn to this ideology that claimed to be universalist, but claimed to ensure that all people were treated the same and that working people would enjoy a lot more of the fruits of the earth. And I can sort of understand why those ideals would have felt and looked appealing at the time. They ended up being communist activists in the late 1920s and in the 1930s, going to prison in Polish cities in the 1930s, surviving the Holocaust by going east to the Soviet Union and surviving it there, and then helping to build up the communist regime in the 50s and 60s in Poland. Of course, ironically, not only did they face the Holocaust and lost a lot of their families to that ideology, but in 1968, the communist government of Poland went on this huge state-sponsored anti-Semitic campaign. There was about 50,000 Jews left in 1967 in Poland, and after 3 years, there was 500 left. The rest of them had been pushed out of the country, thrown out of the country in those 2 or 3 years. And so their experiences I think have shaped me in the sense that I still retain some kind of sympathy for the universalism of the youth, for this idea that how we treat each other shouldn't be shaped by the ethnic groups you're from, and an understanding that, of course, discrimination exists and is something we have to take seriously, that in history, people have often been treated in the most horrible ways based on their ethnicity, and we need to preserve the kinds of tolerant societies that are going to avoid those terrible tragedies. So even if I, certainly don't share their, long-time sympathy for communism, even if I think that those ideals led to a perdition in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, I think something about that aspiration is important. And what's interesting today is that is no longer what the left stands for. That where the left stood for those forms of universalism, it is now quite deeply embraced a form of particularism. It doesn't want to create a society where how we treat each other is less dependent on the kind of identity groups of which we're part. It is celebrating a culture and wanting to create a society in which how we treat each other and even how the state treats all of us is fundamentally dependent on whether you're part of this or that ethnic group, part of this or that religious group, part of this or that sexual orientation or gender identity.
What you're describing, it is noteworthy that you embrace, you recognize some of these proclivities in the modern left while still embracing what you describe at length as liberalism, some values of classical, I don't know if that's the right way to think of it, but classical liberalism, for example, free speech and free association, despite the fact that in your youth, you describe one experience you had in Germany. I think you were in your teens at the time, and there were 10,000 protesters that you saw just outside of your window in Munich to oppose the I think it was the exhibition. There was an exhibition about Germany's war crimes from World War II. As a young Jewish boy, seeing this kind of protest, thousands and thousands of people, one would think that you might be more inclined to embrace. No, I don't want that kind of free assembly, and yet you do. Free speech and free assembly. So, am I reading that right, or?
No, you are. And look, in the middle of the 19th century, there was plenty of terrible racist speech in the United States of forms that today even today in the sewer of Twitter, we would be shocked by. And yet Frederick Douglass called free speech the dread of tyrants. He was aware that free speech allowed slavers in the American South to justify the system and to denigrate African Americans and enslaved people. But he also recognized that it was the one thing that allowed people in the country to criticize the powerful, to argue against slavery, to argue for immediate emancipation. And so, the core insight has always been that free speech actually, by definition, is as much or more so a tool of the powerless than of the powerful. If we allow censorship, let's talk about formal censorship first, but it's true of informal forms of censorship as well. Who's going to be the censor? Well, if it's a government censor, it's somebody who has some kind of office in Washington, D.C. If it's the way we've effectively done censorship now, which is, by private social networks censoring what people are saying, it's some kind of tech executive in Silicon Valley. Those people aren't powerless. By definition, the kind of person who's sitting in the census office in DC, who's sitting in that office in Silicon Valley, is a powerful person. And so I actually think there's a natural way in which the argument for free speech should be a left-wing and a right-wing value. But the left has good reason to defend and embrace that value. And it's been shocking to me how easily big parts of the American left have given up on that value. And I think it really comes from a kind of naivety about the world. I think it's because a lot of those ideas originated on college campuses. And in those contexts, who's going to make the speech code about what you can say or can't say at Smith College or at Harvard University? Well, because those institutions are so left-leaning, it's going to be somebody who's pretty far left-wing. And so you can assume that people are always going to enshrine progressive ideas and outlaw non-progressive ideas. But that's not what would happen if you actually have an all-out fight over what can and can't be said in a society in which a lot of the powerful are not that progressive. So I think it's strategically, it's not just normatively wrong for the left, it's also strategically naive.
Yeah. I was curious, you part of the book, you describe how this has how this has evolved from the academy, the ivory tower, if you will, to an early form of this type of engagement online, Tumblr you describe, and other platforms of social media. And you've been concerned about it for quite some time. I was curious, have you received any pushback as you voiced these concerns, especially with this latest book, from others that are on the left in the academy, or say you spent some time at the New America Foundation, any of your former colleagues there? Have you received any sort of pushback, and if so, what's it been like?
Well, the book is just about to be published, so we'll see what the reactions to it are going to be. It's a little bit early to tell. I've certainly had strong forms of pushback, which is fine, right? I mean, public criticism is different from different from actually advocating for people to get fired or anything like that. It can be hurtful, especially if people who you knew well in graduate school, for example, and used to have lunch with, and they kept asking you for advice when they're writing because they clearly thought you were smart, then post on social media that you must be a complete idiot because you happen to express a view that they disagree with. But that's fine. That's a prerogative. I don't think that's part of cancel culture exactly. So I've been lucky in not having had any kind of organized attempts to get me fired or deplatformed or something like that. What I have experienced is that in the classroom, for example, students are sometimes very cautious about what they say, and that they often tell me in private and office hours and so on that they're worried about bringing the whole selves to the classroom and actually speaking out because of some of the classmates that might try to go around maligning them or impugning their reputations. And these are people with very reasonable views. These are not in any way students who are extremist. At the same time, I also teach many of these questions in the classroom, and and most of the students are very open to that, and we're very grateful to be able to actually talk about those ideas and to encounter many of those ideas for the first time, especially criticisms of the kinds of things they have at this point been spoon-fed since first grade. So I don't want to be catastrophist about it. The sort of the fear that people have to speak up about those ideas and the unjust firings and deplatformings and cancellations that have happened are a real cultural problem. But the deeper problem is the contestation over what kind of assumptions should drive our society. How are we going to be teaching kids? What kind of public policies should we implement? Right. And so I think it's despite all of the worries that I have about speaking out about this and that many of the listeners may have, I think it's the duty of every citizen to try and actually argue for the values. And if that's sometimes uncomfortable, if you're a little bit concerned about upsetting some people, I have some strategies in the book about how to do that in a truthful and forthright way. But I think it's possible to do that, without risking your job.
Yeah, I love, there's something very, toward the end of the book, I made a big note. This is the whole ball game. It's the 6 pieces of advice for arguing and organizing against the identity trap. And I want to deal with that in a second. But first, I want to contextualize this a bit for folks so we understand our terms. Over the last, say, 10 years or 5 years ago, there were popular terms to describe the subjects that you're dealing with, whether it's identity politics or cancel culture, being woke. But you use identity synthesis. So if you would, could you tell us what you mean by identity synthesis, as well as you deal with in the book, what is the lure and what is the trap?
Yeah, perfect. So, look, I don't ultimately care what term people use, and I think any of those terms are kind of fine. It's a weird thing because a lot of ideologies that are structuring our society, we have names for that are agreed upon by people who believe in those ideas and by people who don't believe in those ideas, right? As people say, I'm a socialist, people say, I really think socialism is dangerous. There's people who are liberals and people who blame liberals like me for everything terrible, philosophical liberals. There's, conservatives and again, like all of those terms, people who share those ideologies and people who don't share those ideologies, they agree on what to call those ideologies. And the problem with a set of ideas whose origin I'm chronicling in this book and explaining how they became so powerful and then critiquing in terms of their applications, there's not a term that its defenders and its detractors can agree on. So, the word woke originated as a self-description. I'm woke. I've understood the nature of a world, right? Now it is mostly a negative description, right? Oh, that idea is woke, or that person is woke. And, you sound a little bit like an old man shouting at the clouds when you go, oh, those woke people, right? Those wokies, and so I just, for the purposes of writing this book, which is a critique, but is a serious one, non-polemical one, I wanted a term that's sort of boring enough that nobody is going to get up their blood pressure by hearing it, right? And so I settled on the identity synthesis because fundamentally what we're talking about is a set of ideas about race and gender and sexual orientation, about these forms of group identity and how they should shape our society. And it is a synthesis, as I show in the part that chronicles the intellectual history of these ideas, of thinkers like Michel Foucault and Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak and Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, of traditions of postmodernism and postcolonialism and critical race theory. And so it's a synthesis of these, a summary, a kind of merging of these different ideological and intellectual traditions. So that's why it's the identity synthesis. Now, that's the neutral term, but the book is called The Identity Trap.
Right.
And it's called The Identity Trap because I think that the people who are attracted to these ideas are often well-intentioned. They think that these ideas are the most courageous, radical, uncompromising way to fight against discrimination and racism and sexism and all these terrible things that really exist. But ultimately, they will fail to make a better society by pursuing those ideas. They'll fail to make a better society because this is a political trap. If you, for example, take kids at the age of 6 or 7 or 8 years old and split them up into different identity groups on the basis of a race. Say the black kids go over there and the Latino kids go over there and the Asian American kids go over there. And by the way, the white kids go over there, as now happens in many elementary schools, especially in private elite high schools around the country. You're not creating more anti-racist activists. You're creating more racists. You're creating more zero-sum competition between ethnic groups. You're making it harder for our society to hold together. And the most extreme forms of right-wing populism and these forms of left-wing identitarianism might superficially be in conflict with each other, but fundamentally they help each other. Trump's victory made it easier for these ideas to take hold in mainstream and left-leaning institutions, and the hold these ideas have will make it easier for Trump to get elected in 2024. So one is the yin to the other's yang. So that's a political trap. And there's also a personal trap, which is that what this set of ideas basically promises is that if you really want belonging and meaning in your life and in society, if you want some form of social recognition, what you should do is to lean into the groups to which you belong. So you're really deep down defined by being a man or a woman, by being brown or white, by being queer or straight. But the particular intersection of identities you have is really going to express who you are and then allow society to give you that form of recognition. But that I think is wrong, because what actually defines us much more deeply is who we are as people, whether we're moral, immoral, whether we have a good sense of humor or a bad one, whether we show up for our friends or we don't, the kind of idiosyncratic tastes we have, the thing that makes us, that makes us different from our siblings or other people in our family who might share our intersection of identities, but who are going to be pretty different from us. And so I think it's a personal trap because it promises people that form of recognition and respect that you're never going to get just on the basis of the particular groups you're born into, that always will need to have to do, at least in part, with who you actually are as a person.
Yeah, a lot of my own response to your work, to what I was reading in the book, it comports with my own experience over especially these last 3 years, is that I found myself in situations where there were, albeit a lot of well-meaning, well-intentioned folks that were trying to do good work, but that I was being put in a bucket based on certain data points, whether it was the shade of my hair, the shade of my skin, and then my entire humanity was distilled based on this one or two data points. But I would ask you, what would you say to someone who objects to this to your work now and says, what about the injustices that are still shaping America? You know, there's an urgency in fighting the dangers of right-wing authoritarianism. So why address, as you call it, the identity trap?
Yeah. So look, I like to say that I'm a democracy crisis hipster. I worry about the threats to democracy before it was cool, right?
I say we make that a bumper sticker, the identity crisis, the hipster, the democracy crisis hipster.
You know, I earned it. I bought the first album, you know. I was a graduate student when I started to really worry about the state of our democratic institutions and the threat of populists from the left, like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, but mostly from the right. This is before Donald Trump had ended politics, but in the form of people like Jörg Haider in Austria and Jean-Marie Le Pen and Marine Le Pen in France and Recep Erdogan in Turkey and so on, right? And that was very key to my ideas. I read a book called People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. But in that book, I already started to talk a little bit about why it's a mistake for the left to give up on free speech, for example, right? About the fact that we actually need to be able to have a hopeful vision of a kind of society where we want to create in order to be able to beat those dangerous populists at the ballot box. But if people are going to have a choice between somebody who says the future is awful and blames everybody else, or somebody who says the future is awful and blames them, they're going to go for the person who blames somebody else. And so now in my latest work, I'm really trying to understand these ideas on the left, and I'm trying to show the ways in which they are actually a political gift to the populist right, in which they're inflaming social tensions, in which they make it harder for institutions to function well, in which they push a lot of our politicians out of the cultural mainstream that they need to be in order to win against those dangerous forces on the far right. But I also continue to have the same commitment to rejecting those populist politicians on the right. And, you know, I just, as we're recording this conversation a few days ago, published an article about the upcoming Polish election in the Atlantic, where I really worry about the present government, which is attacking democratic institutions. So, you know, you can do two things at the same time. You can walk and chew gum, but more importantly, these two things are related. In order to beat back these authoritarian populists, in order to build a broad democratic majority for an inclusive country that treats people fairly, we actually need to have a vision of society that takes problems and injustices seriously, but is capable of pointing towards a better future. And then there's a second part of this question, which is, well, how should we think about our present society? And here there's just a fundamental division that really is the heart of a disagreement over the identity trap, right? So one narrative, which is the narrative of the advocates of the identity trap, is to say, look, America has these nice ideals in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, but those were always hypocritical. The point of those was always to pull the wool over people's eyes. They actually had the function of perpetuating racial discrimination and so on. And so rather than trying to live up to those ideals, what we should do is to rip them up and to create a society in which how you're treated and how we treat each other depends on these groups in which we're born. You don't try to actually integrate schools and make sure that people have these friends across racial groups and really come to know each other. You say, no, we're going to put these kids over there and those kids over there and those kids over there. And that's true at the level of public policy in our institutions in lots of different contexts. You don't say, hey, the great thing about college is that, you know, in the first year, you might have a roommate who comes from a completely different world and you're going to end up being friends. And we're going to force you to have a social interaction, which happened for decades. Say, no, we're going to build, as many of these schools in the United States now do, racially segregated dorms in which people from minority groups can choose to, but end up being separate from the white classmates, right? Or you can argue back against that and say, in the proudest tradition in American political thought, which extends from Frederick Douglass via Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King and I would argue something like Barack Obama. No, of course, we recognize that these ideals were hypocritical at the time, that we did not live up to them. Say, as Frederick Douglass did on the 4th of July, that, how can my compatriots be celebrating these ideals while the slavery persists? But they did not want to rip up those principles. They said, no. So therefore, if you're serious about the 4th of July, fight for emancipation, fight for the equal treatment of African Americans, fight for actual inclusion. If you want to be part of those ideals, you've got to make sure that you actually live up to them. That's why Frederick Douglass called free speech the dread of tyrants and insisted that we live up to the Constitution. That's why Martin Luther King said that the check that African Americans had been written by the Bank of Justice was fraudulent, but he didn't want to rip up the check. He demanded that the Bank of Justice cash and honor that check. And that is the fundamental disagreement that we're talking about. So I think we can recognize that American history has been deeply unjust, and we can recognize that there's some injustices that persist. But we can also say, hey, what's allowed us to make progress, what has inspired the most consequential figures in American history fighting for that equality, is a determination to live up to those principles, not the cynical decision to rip them up and create a society where we'll forever be defined by the groups into which we're born.
You have this gritty, dogged optimism that I really admire, but cannot understand sometimes. So you reminded me of, as you're describing this, you're so right that in the heat of battle, what I've come to think of as oppositional politics, we can sometimes lose sight of our core principles. So one of the accounts in the book, you reminded me of National Socialist Party of America versus Village of Skokie. And I forgot that it was ACLU that represented the Socialist Party of America. So remind us, what were the principles that guided the ACLU's decision to defend the right of neo-Nazis marching in the town of Skokie?
Yeah, and so the town of Skokie was important in particular because a lot of Holocaust survivors lived in that town.
Right.
So it's a heavily Jewish town with a number of Holocaust survivors who were present, and this kind of pretty marginal nutcase neo-Nazi party decided as a maximum form of provocation to march through that town. And the ACLU, which has always been, quite a strongly Jewish organization, founded among others, I believe, by a Jew, and whose had litigated at the time was Jewish, decided to defend the Nazi Party, not because they had any kind of sympathy for their ideas, but because, as this lawyer recognized, he said, if I don't stand up for the right of people to speak who I dislike, I'm also going to be undermining the right of the people I do like to speak. If courts can shut down a Nazi party because they don't like it, they can also shut down a radical Black activist, for example. So either we honor the principle of free speech on a neutral basis, or it just becomes a test of political power, where whoever happens to have a lever of power at the time can decide what is acceptable speech and what is unacceptable speech. And so if you want to defend the powerless, you need free speech. It goes back to this point that, who's going to decide on what's allowed and what's not allowed? It's not going to be the powerless. It's going to be the people who have influence in Washington, D.C. and Silicon Valley and so on.
Right. And you reminded me, too, that the ACLU of today is succumbing to these illiberal impulses. It's not just ACLU, but many organizations are succumbing to those same impulses. If we see that happening within our own organizations or our own companies, what are some of the things that we can do to bring this to light and to push back against it and to say, no, we're losing ourselves, and we understand the impulse, but we're fighting against our own values? I don't know if what I'm asking is making sense.
No, I think this is a big question of how do you argue back against that stuff, and how do you argue back against that stuff in a way that is truthful and respectful, but also forthright?
Yeah.
Right. How do you combine being unapologetic and fighting back against this with doing it in an effective way? It's not going to get you fired, but actually might persuade people. Right. And I have a few pieces of advice. The first is that I think you really have to claim the moral high ground. I'm really struck by the fact that a lot of people who argue back against these ideas fall into one of two different kind of pitfalls. One is the people who perhaps come from a more progressive milieu, perhaps are in a more progressive institution. And so they're really nervous when they speak up against those ideas, because they think, oh my God, I'm somehow on the wrong side here. And I might, they might be terribly offended. And so, I'm going to make all of these kind of concessions and preambles before I even say anything. And then by the time I do actually say something, I already sound guilty, right? I'm sounding guilty right now. And the other end of that is the people who are like, well, you know what? Like, if I tell them my opinion, they're going to hate me anyway. So I may as well act like a jerk, like screw these people, how dare you say what, like you're all like idiots, and that's also a way of ceding the moral high ground from the start, right? And what I will say is that, I thought about these ideas very carefully. I'm an anti-racist. I'm a deep, passionate anti-racist. I want to live in a society that's racist. I don't think that Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, the people who've most shaped what we mean by anti-racism in the last couple of years, are in fact very good anti-racists. I don't think that their conception of this is right. And so I have my values, I have my principles. I believe in the ideas for which I'm arguing. I think we're going to make a better world. And so I'm proud of them. And I'm going to argue for them with that self-confidence. I might be wrong about some things. Everybody's wrong about some things, and I want to keep an open mind. But I'm not going to feel guilty about what I'm arguing for, because I thought about this stuff, I've studied this stuff, and I'm arguing for what I think is going to make the world a better place. And so I think, one of the things I want to do with a book is to help people learn the things and do the things they need to have that same self-confidence to argue back from the moral high ground. The other things I will say is, don't vilify those who disagree. As I was saying earlier, part of a trap is that there's a lure, right? A trap, if you think about metaphor, is something that, smart and clever people, well-intentioned people can fall into, and then it ends up being bad for them. And so some of the people who believe in the identity trap are decent people. Don't vilify them, but try to persuade them. And that's related to the fact that today's adversaries can become tomorrow's allies. A lot of the people you should argue with and argue about are actually a reasonable middle, right? The huge majority of Americans who feel the sting of injustice and want to do something about it, but also do think, hey, some of these ideas and norms that we've adapted in the last few years don't really quite seem right. So mostly focus on them. But even some of the true believers can be persuaded. And in fact, some of the most beautiful and influential writers about some of the shortcomings of this ideology, like Ibu Patel, used to really believe in some of those ideas. So you're never going to persuade somebody in this conversation, right? Boom, I make this one brilliant argument and suddenly, that's not how people change their minds, but people do change their minds over time. Another point that is important is that you need to make common cause with other people who are worried about these ideologies, right? So for example, I'm Jewish by origin, I'm not a religious person, but I recognize that Christians have very good reason to oppose these ideas. Because if you think that you're created in the image of your maker, that whether somebody is Christian or Jew or this group or that group is ultimately less important than the fact that we all have a soul that we've been imbued with by the Creator, then any kind of moral outlook that says fundamentally what defines you is the particular group into which you're born should be anathema to your religion. And so I think people who are more secular and people who are more Christian, people actually conservative or Marxist, people who are Buddhist or Jewish, can all come to oppose this ideology for their own reasons. But the important thing here, and that's the last point I'll make on this, is that you do in fact have to have principles of your own. But the danger here is to become a reactionary who just says, anything that anybody calls woke, I'm going to hate. And I'm not going to have my own principles. I'm going to outsource my judgment. I'll say the opposite of whatever those people over there are saying. Then you're just being knee-jerk. Then you're actually allowing your opponent to determine what you think. No, whatever it is that the most deep political and or religious tradition of which you are a part, think about what that tradition tells you to do, how that calls upon you to create a better world, and fight for those principles and speak out against the ideas that criticize when your principles are in conflict with it, and explain where you're coming from. For me, that is the principles of philosophical liberalism, the ideas of political equality and individual liberty and collective self-determination. I think for many of the listeners, it will be partially that, but it may be partially the Christian faith, it may be partially the secular moral convictions, whatever it is, make sure that you're grounded in and guided by those convictions you have for what a good world would look like.
Okay, so this is really important for those who are taking notes. So,
as you all should be.
I might actually put this in the show notes because I really think it's worth underscoring. 1, claim the moral high ground. 2, don't vilify those who disagree. 3, remember that today's adversaries can become tomorrow's allies. 4, appeal to the reasonable majority. 5, make common cause with other opponents of the identity synthesis. And 6, don't become a reactionary. But you also bring up this is another question that arose for me as I was reading through the book. As you describe the how folks are identifying according to sex, race, gender, and sexual identity, but you don't deal as much with religion as part of the identity synthesis. So as I was wondering, how much of that do you think has to do with the fact that Ryan Burge has done a lot of work on this, that less and less people are attending church and other religious services. The fact that more people are identifying as nuns. Does that leave a vacuum that is filled by the identity trap?
Yeah, so let me say 2 things about this. So first of all, when I say, this new set of ideas about race, gender, and sexual orientation, why am I not listing religion as part of that? This is something that my book editor asked me actually and pushed me on. And I thought about including religion. I decided not to for a very specific reason, which is that I don't think that this tradition that I'm outlining cares about religion in that way. They sometimes talk about religion when it is when that category in their mind basically coincides with a disadvantaged racial category. So we might talk about, prejudices against Muslims in the United States, which obviously do exist and are a problem, because they think that most Muslims in the United States are non-white. And so then advocates of identity synthesis become interested in religion, not qua religious belief, but sort of qua proxy for this sort of form of ethnic belonging. But they don't care very much about religious liberty, for example, right? They don't care about the rights of minority religious traditions. And they have very ambivalent relationships towards Christians, but also, for example, to Jews, because they see Jews as either just being white, which is a complicated claim given the history of my great-grandparents.
Yeah, our own family stories, definitely. I was having this conversation with someone the other day. My family's from Ukraine as well, what's known today as, or actually it was then as well, Cherny Ostrov. And, part of my family, it was interesting because different uncles went in different directions. My Uncle Sal, who I got to know, was an very early on as a teenager, early Zionist. One of my uncles became part of the Tsar's army in World War I. Another was active Bolshevik until he wasn't welcomed anymore. So there's any number of strains that this could go. But and I heard a similar story. Anne Frank's father described a similar thing where the concept of whiteness, he was white enough to fight for the Tsar in World War I, or the Kaiser in Germany in World War I, but he wasn't, as we would think of it, white enough to be saved from the concentration camps. So the concept of whiteness is a really tricky one if you're from a Jewish family.
Yeah, and it goes back to the point we were talking about at the very beginning of the conversation, that, oddly enough, for an ideology that is sort of anti-imperialist or that claims to be sort of, against various forms of discursive hegemony, right? The identity synthesis is a deeply American tradition that can only conceive of a world in American terms. So the most extreme form of this is that I saw an article about the terrible mistreatment of Uyghurs in China. And the headline writer had given it the title, white supremacy in China, which is absurd, right? Because we wouldn't think of people who are Han, which is the majority ethnic group in China, as white, but they could only conceive of a world in terms of, there's whites and non-whites, and the whites are the oppressors, and so on.
It's like a group narcissism in a way. We can't see beyond our own
categories of what determines groups, right? But of course, in the Third Reich there was anti-black racism as well. But the fundamental category was Aryan versus non-Aryan, and that's a category that splits what today in the United States would be seen as different white groups apart from each other, right? So we have to recognize these multiplicities of how we can sort of think of each other. And so anyway, so that's sort of on the religion point. That's why I don't think that religion is key to how the advocates of this ideology conceptualize the conceptual terrain. But the question you're asking is partially a different one, which is this a kind of ersatz religion? Is this a substitute for religion in certain kinds of ways? Is it because of the secularization of the United States that these ideas have so much appeal? Now, John McWhirter, who I respect a lot, has argued that it's literally a religion, that actually sort of what he calls wokeness is really just, the woke of the elect, in sort of similar forms to Puritan ideology, and it's a form, it's a religious catechism and so on. I disagree with that. I think that what he's picking up on is a certain kind of quasi-religious fervor, which was also true of many other political traditions, which is true of many nationalists, which is true of certain Marxists, and so on and so forth. So I don't think it's literally a religion. I do think that that America's moral imaginary has been deeply shaped by Puritanism. And that is true on parts of the right and in parts of more conservative or religious circles. But that's also really true in a lot of left-wing and progressive circles that have completely rejected the the commandments of Puritanism, right? They don't worry about sex before marriage or whatever stuff like that. They're fine with that. But the idea that our community must be morally pure. Right. And that if there's some member of our community that's not morally pure, it's going to lead us astray, and the devil is among us, and we got to make sure to expel them. Right. And this is all ultimately the most important thing is our internal goodness and displaying and preserving our external goodness. And that's in some ways more important than the outcomes, right? What really matters is that we're acting morally. That I think has something to do with this tradition. And so, the identity synthesis is already proving to be really fecund around the world. You're seeing offshoots of it spring up in lots of different countries. But my prediction, which we might be able to test in 10 or so years, is that within Europe, for example, Protestant countries like the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands are likely to embrace wokeness more than Catholic countries like Italy or Spain, because I think that particular form of moral fervor and that particular form of purifying your community more naturally comes to a certain form of Protestantism than to Catholicism.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't even thought of that. That different denominations and the cultures that have evolved in those denominations the soil might be better soil for wokeism or the identity trap, the identity synthesis. I do need to ask you, though, I touched on this a little earlier, and so did you. In interviews after the release of that, it was your 2022 book, The Great Experiment, which, by the way, I'd also recommend. We got a lot of reading to do. The Great Experiment: Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. You said you actually have reason to be optimistic. So are you still optimistic? And if so, are you optimistic for the same reasons?
I am cautiously optimistic. So
Okay.
what I've been saying is that, when I look at cable news, when I look at MSNBC or Fox News, I'm really worried about the country. When I look at Washington, D.C. and some of the strength that somebody like Donald Trump continues to have in the polls, the command he still has over the Republican Party, I'm very concerned. When I look at, in the context of my last book, The Great Experiment, specifically the state of our diverse democracies, how members of different ethnic and cultural groups are getting along, and how that compares to 100 or 50 or 20 years ago, I'm actually quite optimistic. One striking stat is that in the 1960s, 95% of Americans thought that interracial marriage was immoral. Today, less than 5%. Think it's immoral. And we know that's a real change in behavior because the number of mixed race children has actually gone up very significantly in the last decades. That's just one big headline finding. There's lots of other others, right? But when I look at what society actually looks like, how people live, whether they have friends and neighbors from different groups with whom they get along, there's much work to be done. But I am optimistic. I think we have made real progress. So am I optimistic about our ability to stand up against these twin dangers of far-right populism, but also these sort of deeply identitarian ideas on the left? I think it's going to take a very long time. I think both of these phenomena are going to stay with us for the next 20 or 30 years. And that's why it's important to read up on this topic and to understand this topic, to actually do the intellectual work in a way that I think collectively we really haven't done over the last years, because this debate is going to be with us for a good number of years to come. But I do also think that most Americans are instinctively, philosophically liberal, even if they don't know it, even if they might not call themselves that, even if they might not be able to define what I mean by philosophical liberalism or what they mean by philosophical liberalism. And what I mean by that is that the idea, for example, that you should allow somebody to speak even if you really hate what they're saying, that's not a natural idea. It's sort of hard to maintain. And everybody sometimes like, oh, just shut that person up. That's so nasty. Just get rid of them, right? But when people are treated in unfair ways, when people are hounded out of their jobs in arbitrary ways, when we are putting limits on the ways in which we can engage with each other culturally, the ways in which we can inspire each other culturally, as we increasingly are in the context of so-called cultural appropriation, I think that people actually feel the injustice of that in their bones. There's something about the values in the societies in which they want to live where they're saying, that's not what I want. I don't want that kind of society. And that reasonableness goes pretty deep, actually. So there's a great study about American history and attitudes to American history, right? And at the moment, if you listen to Democrats or Republicans, or you listen to, the quote-unquote woke left or the, MAGA right, they have these really, really polarized ideas about America. It's either 1619 or 1776. Right? Either America is, defined by slavery, or we should talk about it as little as possible. A great majority of Americans reject those views. A great majority of Americans, including most Democrats, think that, George Washington and other founders were great people who are worthy of deep respect. That there's many wonderful things about the United States. We should be proud of the Constitution. Republicans often think that Democrats don't think that, but Democrats do think that. By the same token, great majorities of Americans think that school children should be taught about the evils of slavery, that they should be taught about the civil rights movement, and that Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks were heroes. And again, Democrats think Republicans don't think that, but the majorities of Republicans do, in fact, think that, according to those polls. And we could talk about many other political issues as well, including really complicated ones like questions around trans people and abortion and so on. I think on many of those issues, you actually have reasonable majorities of Americans in ways that are rarely reflected in the political debate.
Yeah. We talked to Todd Rose a couple months ago and his latest work, Collective Illusions. And I'm oversimplifying a great deal. It's a great book, but ultimately what he was saying was a vast majority of us aren't nearly as divided as we think we're divided. So that's kind of what you're touching on. Now, your book is really terrific and is just such a bullseye for the work that we're trying to do here. We went through as we described, the 6 pieces of advice for arguing and organizing against the identity trap. And then there's also a complement to that you expound on, that one for organizations, institutions, and companies. I want to bring this home for, at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to help me survive Thanksgiving dinner. So I call it the TP&R question. What do you think each of us can do to be better able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across these differences, people who think differently than we do, who have different beliefs than we do, who get their news, as you just said, from different sources than we do? How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
Well, first of all, I really had 2 goals with this book, right? One is to improve the arguments that people who already worry about these ideas make. I think a lot of people have become worried about the identity trap. But there haven't been a lot of really good books about this. I don't think there's been a book that's approachable and comprehensive in the way that my book is. And so as a result, a lot of these arguments are bad and knee-jerk. It's like, oh, this is woke, this is terrible, right?
And by the way, one of the things that's remarkable about your book that I really, really appreciated is that you articulate arguments that you disagree with, but you give them you articulate them in a fair way. In other words, it's the mindset that you start out with is, let me see if I understand this correctly, and you give it a fair hearing before you then start to critique it in a constructive way. So that I just wanted to point that out, that's one of the things I really appreciate.
Yeah, I mean that's really meaningful to me. It's something I aim for. I mean, one way of putting this, there's this great term that's not as well known as it should be. So people might have heard of a Turing test, which is roughly speaking whether a machine can pass as human. There's also a great term of ideological Turing test, right? Can somebody who is conservative, explain an argument that a liberal person might make in such a way that the liberal person would say, yes, that's my argument, right? And vice versa. And I think in America, collectively, we continually fail the ideological Turing test in basic ways. When somebody argues for a position we don't like, we say, well, why do they think that? Well, because I'm evil and I want to do evil things. Like, no, that's not how people talk about themselves, right? So I hope that my book passes the ideological Turing test, that it presents these ideas in the way that the strongest advocates of these ideas would present them. And then I argue with them and I explain why I'm not convinced by them, why I think that they're mistaken. We have good responses to them. But that's really my ambition, to give people the tools to argue against these ideas in a profound way that's guided by principles rather than that's knee-jerk. But then the other aim I really have is to help people have those conversations. There's a second group that feels really torn, that says, hey, I recognize that there's many injustices in America and that there are really bad things that have happened in our history and bad things that still happen today. And so when people say, I'm the person who in the most maximalist way is going to fight against this, that's really tempting, right? And at the same time, I wonder, perhaps it's not just that we're going too far, we're really actually fighting for the wrong thing. Perhaps, separating kids by race at the age of 6 is not going too far in the right direction. Perhaps it's actually going in the wrong direction. And so I have this discomfort with this, and I feel torn. And the book is also supposed to be for them. So one thing that you might do, and I know this is self-promotional, I'm acknowledging that, is give this book to your sister or to your brother-in-law who's more tempted by these ideas, perhaps.
Right.
And sit down together and have a conversation on the basis of something you've read that you can agree or disagree with, but that gives you a text to grapple with together in a cooperative way. Do a book club in which you really think about these ideas together through this book and other books, right? But let's say you haven't done that and you're sitting at a Thanksgiving table. Look, it depends on personalities, right? Some people are reasonable, and it's worth talking to them and engaging with them. And some people who you might love, who might be great people in other ways, are unreasonable about politics and topics like that. And it probably is best to just let it slide and avoid politics at the table. But if we do talk about politics, then go back to the maxims we're talking about. Claim the moral high ground. Explain that you're arguing for what you're arguing because you really believe in these ideas, but also have charity towards the person you're speaking with. Recognize that they are arguing for their positions because they want to make the world a better place as well. And then, try to pass the ideological Turing test. Realize that they're not arguing for what they want because they're evil people. I don't think the people whose ideas I criticize in this book are evil people. Some of them are. There was always in every group some evil people, but most of them are genuinely convinced it's going to make the world a better place. So come from that place of grace and of giving people the benefit of a doubt, and that's how I think you can be firm but thoughtful, right? You can be unapologetic but respectful.
Yeah. Now, this is a totally ignorant question, but the ideological Turing test, how do you spell that word, just so I can? So
Turing is Turing. And I believe it's
Turing. Okay.
And I believe it's a concept that Alan Turing came up with. So
okay.
That's why it's called the Turing test.
Okay. All right. So one of my last questions is whether do you have any questions for me?
Well, how do you think that religion does play into this, and what is how do you think religious people should grapple with these ideas, in particular, considering that they will be both motivated by fighting against injustices, right? Because of compassion and the duty to look after your neighbor, the duty to look after people who are in weak positions, and I think do have a kind of universalism inbuilt that wants to focus on our soul is the most important unit of analysis rather than the group to which we belong.
So I don't mean to be presumptuous, but I think you're asking two different questions. One is more dealing with religion and religious communities. One is more of a theological question, and they're related, but I think they're two separate questions. So theologically, I would think that starts with our own. C.S. Lewis, I think, referred to it as the numinous, the sense of transcendence, right? That there's something beyond me. There's something beyond what we can see materially, right? And if we have a sense of that, there's a sense of that helps me tap into the universal, right? The other part of that is my religious community, and frankly, I've been really ambivalent about my own religious. I grew up in observant. We went to an Orthodox synagogue, but I became a Christian when I was 28 or 29. And I've been very ambivalent because a lot of folks I go to church with, if Jesus walked into our Bible study, they'd say, "Get out of here, you hippie." They wouldn't recognize him or what he's teaching on. So I've been very ambivalent, but ideally that religious community has to grapple with how we live together better and how we welcome our neighbors in a more lovingly charitable way. How do we overcome our selfish impulses to do these things like what you're talking about with classical liberalism, collective self-determination, individual freedom, political equality. These things don't necessarily come naturally collectively. They come naturally for me to fight for myself, but not in the collective. So the religious, I think, is practice. Each week we go and practice these virtues in a community. So I'd have to think a lot about that, more about that. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's where my head goes.
Yeah, and I mean, there's always the tension between the ideal and the practice, and it feels to me. I guess I was asking. I took myself to be asking the theological question, but you're right to take it to a community question, because what the theological answer is one thing, and I think that answer is quite clear. What that looks like in practice is another answer, and that, by the way, is one of the defenses of liberalism. But some of the critics of liberalism always say, but look, you're not living up to your values. And no society in the history of the world has ever fully lived up to its values. The question is whether an ideology allows countries to be better by trying to live up to those values, and gives people the tools to criticize ways in which a society is not living up to its values. And if we go back to the fundamental disagreement here, it's that some people say, hey, there's these ways in which we're not living up to our values, so the values must be terrible. But that's going to be true of any set of values. I think what makes liberalism unique and appealing is that A, the attempt to live up to our values has allowed us to make tremendous progress.
Yeah.
And B, that we preserve the tools for people to make those critiques. But hopefully those critiques are going to be constructive, pushing us towards living up to the ideals, not ripping them up.
Yeah, yeah. My oldest kid lives up in Humboldt, California, and they're participating in what some might think of as religious practices or religious community. I don't necessarily think of it that way. I was curious to learn about their community and some of the rituals they participate in. So Savannah welcomed me and Lisa into a few things, and it was tea. It was so beautiful. It's the simple ritual. Ritual is almost too intense, but the practice of making tea and pouring tea for a small circle of friends. To me, it could seem mundane in a way, but it was really profound and beautiful in other ways. Pouring tea for each other and, being together. There is something really profound about that.
You're fueling one of the few material ambitions I have in life, and that's to have a great cocktail bar at home and to have a great tea bar at home. I think those are the two things one should have at home.
Good whiskey and good tea. I love it. It's a good start. So before we go, how can folks follow you, find the Identity Trap, your other writing at The Atlantic and Persuasion, and all of the great work that you're doing?
So please do read the Identity Trap. I really feel like I've done a tour of duty here. I did a lot of work to understand these ideas and to explain them and to hopefully improve our discourse and empower people to argue against those ideas where we disagree with them. So I would be really grateful if you read the book and recommend it to your friends and perhaps gift it to that sister or to that brother-in-law. Please subscribe to my podcast, The Good Fight. Subscribe to my magazine, The Persuasion, at persuasion.community, which is trying to stand up for the philosophically liberal tradition against threats from the extremes. And there will be plenty. So
persuasion.community Persuasion.community and the Good Fight podcast, really great conversations. I feel like I'm working out. It's like an intellectual, philosophical workout when I listen. I love it. Absolutely love it. So this was really terrific, Yascha. I hope it's not the last time.
I'm very happy to come back on. This is really fun.
Yeah, a ton of fun. Thanks so much. And now you're based in the DC area, right? Or Maryland?
I'm based in Baltimore and New York at the moment, yeah. Okay.
All right. So tea and whiskey on me next time we're in the same zip code.
I look forward to it.
Awesome. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, subscribe, rate, review, and tell a friend about TP&R, Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Seriously, taking the time to write a review does make a difference, and telling a friend about Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other particular episode, what we're trying to do overall, it might end up spurring you into a great conversation. And you could be talking politics and religion without killing each other. So I'm easy to find too. Corey S. Nathan at COREY S as in Sam NATHAN at Corey S. Nathan. Now, go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.